Yeah,
That's why I
Yeah.
tried to make a point to say, no collective bargaining, no strike.
yeah, okay.
Okay.
All right, so
Well,
with
I think
that,
that needs to be, what do we do? I think there has to be clarity because you don't want this, not an anti-union statement by any means. It's a matter of practicality in a unique situation because of a variety of things that I think need to specify.
yeah, all right. So let's work on that. So we have until 3:30. I know folks may have to leave right at 3:30 and we, just to remind everybody again, we'll have one more meeting and then a final meeting to review the recommendation that the Ledge Council has put together. So to the extent that we can be clear in the next 40 minutes on what we want the report to say, I think that would be helpful for Ledge Council anyway. So where we left off, we had a couple of different conversations about specific things in the framework. There was a suggestion that we not focus on the framework, but focus on some of the other sort of underlying issues. So thoughts on how we want to proceed here? Reiterating what anybody said beforehand, that you want to just get out there, make sure we're all clear on.
Did you want a motion to the effect that we're not going to recommend collective bargaining, much as we respect it and see that there are spaces where it's appropriate, and we, instead of going to look at the underlying conditions and address them more directly?
Okay. I don't know if it needs to be in the form of a motion, but that's good. No, good. I think that provides some clarity.
I think that, I mean, as Senator Brock said, that raises 100,000 questions of its own. And while I think I like the idea of moving in that direction, more of a collaborative approach, then I have no idea what the mechanism would be. And I don't know if there's an existing framework like, the farm program to model it after, or what the enforcement would be, or by. And I like the concept, but I have no idea at all how it would work. As opposed to organizing, and I do understand how that works, and we have a system to support it, but
So what, just say again what the concept is that we're not sure would work.
So we're talking about a program that would address the underlying needs of safe, healthy housing, of livable, at least minimum wage, safe working conditions. A framework to support that or require that sounds good to me, but I don't know whose bailiwick that is, who enforces or who inspects, or is complaint driven, or I don't know that we have to come up with those answers, but there are just a whole lot of large questions for me about how that would work.
Senator Collins?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So to Robin's point, and I think this list, if we come to the agreement that what we've seemingly agreed to, we obviate the need to address a lot of these other things, because if this other piece goes together in a collaborative effort, it will reduce the rest of these to not being needed to be addressed. And again, just to zero in on what Robin was saying, I think we could ask both the House and Senate committees on agriculture, economic development, House General, whoever else wants to get involved, that it be their requirement, or at least jurisdiction, to come up with specific ways that this recommendation could take place. I don't think we have enough time left to investigate this the way it should be. But I think a standing committee has, 2 years to do it.
Right. So I think there's clarity in some areas and not others, right? So minimum wage and overtime have specific statutory frameworks that we would put agricultural workers back in. They're exempted in these cases. So it's not simple in that we could get deeper into, are there ways that we phase in the overtime pay structure differently like other states have, so that it's recognizing it's a longer workday. Generally, we say at 55 hours or 60 hours, something changes. When talking about the actual sort of like OSHA, how are we overseeing safety, cleanliness, and well-being? That is maybe a good question for the agriculture committees if they haven't taken it up lately, or, we can explore that as an employment question, as like a employee safety question. But I think, sorry, it should be on suspense. I think we've done so much to understand the pros and cons of the organizing structure that if we can be agnostic about the overall question of whether or not it's important to have it taken up, but if it is, we found that it should be a lower threshold of employees, or, just what we found that made more sense in the parameters without trying to come to agreement on every detail where we just don't agree. But if we all said, oh, we generally heard this, and that would be a more ideal way to go if the committees want to explore that, we'd just be doing a little bit of the work. We'd be summarizing what we heard rather than sort of saying, you must, create a collective bargaining unit, and here's how it should look. It would just be, we found this wasn't the best avenue to help the quality of life of workers, and we would instead focus on this. But if you do go down this road, in addition, otherwise, these are some of the parameters that we found useful. Including, with the right to strike, what I can't remember the last time we looked at were all of the different exemptions that existed in the other laws. So they said, Washington State or Kansas or whoever would say, farm workers have the right to strike except in such and such cases.
Right.
Again, if that ends up taking forever, I don't think it's as good of a use of our time as saying how much we agree on standard employment protections and practices that those committees of jurisdiction that deal with employment law, really should be able to manage with Damien and or with Sophie, with Damien's, existing knowledge.
Okay, so the way you just framed it makes sense to me. I'm not sure that it's the same way that other people have framed it, or was everyone else's intent. But how are people feeling about the way that Keisha just laid it out?
Sure. I'm comfortable with handing it to the Senate and House Ag committees. I feel like the time that we've spent is well spent, and I think we've reached some conclusions that those committees don't have to reinvent that wheel, right? And that's valuable.
So if, for example, we were to say, we recommend that the exclusion for ag workers from the minimum wage law be removed, that's our recommendation. How would people feel about supporting that as part of a larger package of things?
Yes.
I would just say, I think it's really close to I don't know what it'll become next year, but it's, if the average wage right now that we heard, even on the lower side of those who might feel aggrieved, was $11.75, and others think it's much higher, then giving them the same floor that exists for every other type of employee in the state, I wouldn't think moves things too much, except for those who might be being underpaid and exploited.
So, and then the related one is overtime, which is, maybe not quite as straightforward. So let's talk about that. Just if there were a proposal to remove the exemption from overtime for ag workers, how are people feeling about that?
Again, I just want to reiterate, I think it's going to be detrimental to not just the farmers, but the people that we are trying to protect. This is the workers, because farmers will just say, okay, you're done at 40 hours.
So is there, now we know what New York did.
Yeah.
And the state of New York has essentially supported the farmers with a tax credit that reimburses them, I think. I think that was the idea anyway. And they're phasing it out, and it's not clear whether that is permanent or not, but that's one thing they're doing. So, I mean, there are, I guess, maybe ways we could approach it. We could say we recommend this, provided the farmers are not the ones left holding the bag, which I think is the concern. And it's for the employee's sake. So,
Sorry, I didn't quite, and
Yeah.
you said that we support this provided that the farmers,
we're not, we're made whole, essentially. So in New York, they're eligible for a tax credit. They're basically reimbursed
where's that coming
from the state.
and where's the state getting it?
Well, the general fund, I don't know
Where's the
exactly.
general fund getting it? And so we're gonna increase property taxes in order to pay, this goes to the same thing we do all the time. If we talk about it's going to someone else, it's going to the taxpayer. And the only question of which taxpayer. And is that something that we want to do?
So, well, that's right. I mean, that's really the question that I'm putting out to the group.
Well, maybe what it is that you're saying is that we took this narrow focus and we looked at agriculture and labor issues in Vermont. And we found that they were sufficiently different from other agriculture issues that the state has dealt with, that it needs to be dealt with in a focused way, and the best place to do that is the committees of jurisdiction.
So, yeah, I agree with Randy. That word exemption makes me nervous. Because it implies that all hands are off the table and this is the way it's going to be. I think I would rather phrase it by saying that consideration by the standing committee shall be given to address the overtime landscape with respect to farmers and workers, and maybe even a minimum wage too. I think what we're going to find, if you really look at it, and I'll use a percentage that I don't have any reason to do, 80 or 85% of the farmers are already paying minimum wage. I think there's not that many that don't. The overtime to me is a whole different ball of wax, and it's much more complicated.
The nature of the work.
So rather than just blanketly say overtime, that's exempt too, and then they have to deal with it, some sort of more gentle way of phrasing that the standing committee should give consideration for coming to a conclusion about that.
So you would be opposed, it sounds like Senator Brock would be opposed to just saying we recommend removing the exemption, just and maybe, I don't want to put words in your mouth either, but maybe also be opposed to using a New York State style approach to compensating, recognizing that the cost is coming from somewhere. So, yes, that's clearly somebody would be paying for that ultimately. How do other folks feel about it, if at all,
I would be curious to
over time?
understand more about the idea that by providing overtime will limit the hours of an ag worker to 40 hours a week, because a farmer would say, I'm not going to be able to afford that. They're still going to need that additional 20 to 30 hours that farmer is working. And likely that means they'll have to hire somebody else So they're not going to be saving any money by hiring for an additional 20 to 30 hours a week to make up for the amount that they didn't want to pay in overtime when it's time and a half. So I'm just curious, what is the actual economic struggle when, where are we gonna make up that 30 hours? You know, that's still gonna have to be
You
paid.
need the labor.
They need the labor anyway, and if they're going to still cut you off at the 40 and have to hire somebody else, they're gonna be in the same economic position as they would be if they just paid overtime. And I think the argument of saying that it's the nature of the work, yes, it's the nature of the work, but how many positions are we out there asking people to take pay cuts because it's the nature of the work? We want agriculture to be something that people look at as being a real lucrative position. We want more young people in ag. We want more folks to get into this position and not being like, you're going to get into this, but it's not going to really serve you for the future financially. I just think that needs to shift if we're going to look at this industry as something that is going to be viable and sustainable long term. And part of that is wages. So I just think we ought to think about that too.
So Sophie, many of the states that do have the overtime provision have different hour thresholds. Is that so? I mean, recognizing that it's like, it's just not a 40-hour work week. Usually they might say 50, 55, 60.
Seems generally like 60 is kind of, you must pay it over 60, and then they're kind of trying to phase in some places. to bring it down. There was in the October 11th committee meeting, which I don't think really got discussed, but there was a report from New York on what they're doing. So they're currently, I think, at 56 hours. And then they've been working with Cornell. There's the state is funding a group to look at it. And, there was a report about what it's going to be in terms of what the impact's going to be if you go to 50 to 48, etc. I would say one of the issues in New York was a lot of the H2A workers, just back to the number of hours. Because the committee did get testimony about H2A workers in particular, want to work as many hours as possible, get the money, and then, go home at the end of the season. And so there was a real concern about that, and the H2A workers, which I guess are used quite heavily in New York, would just go choose work in other states. I mean, I think that's the other piece, is there's a labor shortage for these jobs. So, I think there's always that fear of losing the employees you have. If you've got rules that aren't working for the employees, the workers, they're going to relocate to other states.
The testimony we heard this morning made sense to me that if as a employer, I was currently paying, above minimum wage and now was required to pay overtime, I could just change the math and the employee would be just as happy because the employee's take-home pay wouldn't change at all. But that's not true for H-2A visa holders because they do have that higher required wage, right? So the employer couldn't just make that change quickly and be in compliance.
But not all farmers are using H2A workers.
They're not seasonal.
Right, yeah. I guess I'm, and just thinking it wouldn't work for everybody. It might work for a lot of people, but it wouldn't work for the H-2A. Okay.
So we could say X number of states, at least have a provision for overtime pay above 60 hours. We think that's like reasonable. I'm just throwing something on the table.
Yeah.
60 hours is like 10 hours a day for 6 days, or, it's a lot of hours. So we might just agree that beyond that, they should be compensated differently. I mean, certainly if you need the money and that's your place of employment, you're going to keep maybe working as many hours as you can, but at some point, the fair, non-exploitative thing to do would be to pay them differently above that many hours when they can't take a lot of rest.
I mean, I think that's like, you have to consider it from the perspective of, okay, if they are working 10 hours a day, 6 hours a week at 60 hours total, it's like, you're increasing the risk of injury, you're increasing the risk of illness, you're increasing the risk of just like overall damage to your body without them having any kind of like paid sick leave or paid time off when it comes to an injury or something like that. And it's just like, you're asking them to do so much with very little in return, and you don't want to pay them for the work that they're doing. Like that is just like morally wild to me to even consider that this is like, that's the heart of the debate to me. Like, that is the heart. This is an industry that brings in like over $3 million a day in economic like flow in the state. And it's just like, and we're not willing to even consider just like a marginal increase for these workers. It just like blows my mind. Where are we weighing the real impact here?
But it's not the farmers asking them.
Right.
The workers wanting to work those extra hours.
Yes, definitely. But maybe they'd want to work them even more if they were getting paid more for it also. It's like that is recognizing that they're in a financial position where they desperately need that money. So they're beholden, you know, they're beholden to that. They have no choice. That is not necessarily like this free-flowing position of being like, I am choosing this for myself because this is what I can do. This is the work that they likely have to be in based on that. And they're at the whim of what we're deciding for them. And I just think that there's a real moral component in that when you're considering it too, as well as a recognition of the morals for the farmer who's struggling financially also. But debating whether or not somebody should get paid for the work they're doing, that should be fairly straightforward for me. People need to get paid because they're shoring up an industry that is such a massive economic drive for our state. And we know that. And when we talk about wanting to celebrate and save and support the dairy industry, then that's not just the industry, that's the workers within the industry as well. And I think that that's a really important narrative that we need to remember in that.
Do you want to say like 56 hours? That's 8 hours, 7 days a week.
I'd rather have the committees of jurisdiction do their due diligence,
Okay.
come up with those figures.
Some kind of phased in overtime pay.
I'm sure they'll take testimony and find out what works and what doesn't.
So can we agree on, I want to see whether we can have a baseline, we can agree on that we should include here a general recommendation that there needs to be an examination of the exemption from overtime for ag workers without any specifics or with some numbers? You're suggesting without any numbers.
I am.
You're saying with some numbers. Other thoughts on that?
I'm thinking without numbers. I mean, I appreciate Heather's moral argument. So good friends with a grass-fed dairy farm, they would close. They already support it with another business. And they just, there is no fat to trim. And at the same time, I completely agree, you know, so I don't know where to go, but I see saying, yes, you must pay overtime, as saying, okay, your farm will close.
Or we say, yes, we want to look at the idea of paying overtime with alternative options of state-supported funding mechanisms that could really help. I mean, we have something, when milk prices drop and farmers aren't getting what they want per hundredweight, and we're talking about like federal milk marketing order, we have insurance policies in place that make up for the amount that farmers are not getting if there are fluctuations. I think that there are creative ways to also look at how we address those slight fluctuations in overtime. And maybe that'll cause for a bigger conversation around, should people be working 60, 80 hours a week? I mean, that is insane on somebody's body. And so there are mechanisms in place that could be creative that would account for some of those losses that I think is very much within the state's ability to determine how we can help cover some of those additional burdens. But I think saying that it will close a farm, I hear you. I mean, my farm, I mean, we're dying and like, we don't want to die on the backs of folks who are struggling either. And I think that that's a really important tension point, where it's like, where can we get creative in the actual funding sources to make up for some of those? I just think saying no to overtime is a lot.
Well, I'm just concerned about this committee producing a report that says we'll find the money someplace else without any idea where we're gonna find the money.
But are we fine with saying we'll figure it out in the committees of jurisdiction without giving the committees of jurisdiction any guidelines on what they should be figuring out themselves? I mean, we seem to be comfortable with that.
Unless we have the answer, we shouldn't be telling them an answer that is a non-answer to the committees of jurisdiction. We don't know where the money's coming from, other than taxes. If there's some magic source of money that is known to us, we ought to articulate it. And if it isn't, then the best choice is to send it to the committees of jurisdiction with a recommendation that in the event that they can find additional sources of funding that aren't disadvantageous to the state elsewhere or in another way. But, you know, as we sit here, we say, hey, we're going to raise income taxes, we're going to raise property taxes, we're going to raise something else in order to pay overtime for farm workers. I don't know how well that's going to be accepted by the public.
I mean, I don't know that anybody actually said that. I do think that you earlier, Representative Supranat, suggested that there was a considerable amount of state money currently being paid to farmers for environmental.
So like water
Water
quality,
quality,
yeah, like $6 million.
That
So we're
could
going to
be-
take that away. If we're going to stop doing it, that's fine. But who's going to do that? And the answer is the committees of jurisdiction who spent the money in the first place. But I don't think we're in a position to tell them to go find it by using water quality or whatever kind of money. I think they have to decide that.
But why can't we recommend it and then they decide?
So I think that's the question, what are we recommending?
We're not recommending that they do it. We are maybe recommending that they examine it, that
Yeah.
they look for other sources of income sufficient, consistent with a variety of conditions to find the additional funds to do it. But I don't think we should be telling them to do it or recommending specifically that they do it. That they consider doing it consistent with other obligations.
But wouldn't a recommendation just serve as a guiding post and they could take or leave whatever they wanted out of that recommendation? I mean, it's in the nature of the word itself. It's not prescriptive. It's simply saying, here's what we recommend. What's that?
It's a nudge.
Yeah, but then
Recommend you
maybe-
spend some more of this money that we can't afford to spend.
or we recommend you being creative about the money that is already available and allocating it to places that would actually have a
That
real.
They allocate your
impact.
resource, they allocate the limited resources you have in a different way in order to accomplish this mission.
Yes, because I think the ways in which farmers have the ability to shift their agricultural practices that would help the environment versus their ability to just out of pocket pay for overtime benefits is a lot harder. And so they could pay for benefits and they could decide that they're going to shift their practices so they don't need the additional funding for those environmental components.
Obviously, in terms of making recommendations, I'm hesitant to make recommendations that I don't have anything behind them other than my guesswork.
So.
I'm uncomfortable with doing that and laying that on. The committees of jurisdiction have perhaps the capability of deciding how to allocate funds and how to order how they allocate it, but we're not in a position, I think, very easily to say, hey, go spend some more money that we don't have.
I don't think that's it. I think it's saying, hey, the money that we do have, let's think about how to creatively use it in a way that would be really effective. I think you're thinking.
That's where
it's
I
like
think this committee could
withdraw
make great
revenue.
benefit is making some suggestions that are specific, but these are pie in the sky. We don't have any ideas how to do this.
So Senator Romney,
Well, I mean, I would sort of approach it from another, kind of another lens that is squarely within the agriculture committees, which is you already probably give money to farms for specific financial incentives and inducements and supports, et cetera. And is there a threshold at which, in order to get that financial support, you need to follow some of these best practices?
Yes, I think that would be a lovely avenue.
Okay.
Yes.
so looking beyond the overtime question even, and some of the other things that may be harder to quantify or
Right.
harder to,
You have like adequate washer dryer system, you know, have plans to reduce injuries and you have an overtime pay system in place.
If you're going to be eligible for specific
Right.
funding sources, then you also must meet these criteria or threshold.
okay?
Which means you wouldn't have to be taking away any kind of money. You would just be saying, here is a set of guidelines that you must meet if you're going to be eligible for that specific grant or funding source you're going for.
Talking about reducing injuries, part of it, what I heard from the folks from Fiber Justice was that a number of people don't have a safe, warm place to sleep. If you don't get a good night's rest and then you're working 12 hours with equipment, it's a recipe for disaster, whether you're getting overtime payment or not for those times. And if you're not getting a break for 12 hours straight, to me, that's another red flag. So there's all kinds of things I think we could bake into these recommendations that you don't work more than 6 hours without a 15-minute break. Like, spell it out if you have to, and use these public dignity guidelines as well as the H2A guidelines as this is formulated to make sure we're not leaving out things that the rest of us take for granted. We're gonna get a good night's sleep in a warm house. These folks don't necessarily have that guarantee. Like, that's a shame.
So, use the H2A program guidelines to, this sort of a benchmark for eligibility for state funding. And by doing that, accomplish some of the things that we were talking about earlier. I think that you would, that Robin, you were saying, I'm not sure how we would go about doing that. Does this address that concern or is it a different concern?
Keisha's suggestion does address the incentivizing.
Yeah,
I think I'm reluctant to say, to recommend what program to base recommendations on. Because I don't know H2A versus Mocha Dignity versus the farm program. But those are all models that we used to improve working conditions.
maybe we list them as examples and
Yeah,
not be prescriptive there.
So we'd be saying essentially that we recommend that the committee's jurisdiction examine funding that be given to farms right now or designed to support farms in whole or in part. Be examined to determine whether they can be re-engineered or redirected in order to accomplish some of these ends that may result in, it's kind of mealy mouth, but that's essentially what I'm hearing.
That's what-
Right, we don't spend any more money.
I'm with you.
Okay. So I think we probably don't need to go back right now to framework questions, just because we're running out of time. Sophie, you've been diligently taking notes and I'm going to suggest that it's not critical that you feel right now that you understand exactly where we landed on everything. We can have a conversation and then we can follow up. But
So I have a question, and this is just because I'm new to doing this.
yes,
Is it possible if I draft something then to share with the committee and get feedback before our next meeting rather than have a draft
Yeah,
after the next
No,
meeting and
yes.
then it's like, oh no, we've got a different direction.
yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's what we should do, and that's what we would typically do, something like that. So, yeah. I do just, and I'm only one person, but I will suggest that to the extent that we can reach any consensus on any of the collective bargaining framework questions, I think that would be helpful too. Just to the future legislature, if there comes a point, it may not be in the next biennium, the coming back down the road. We have put some thought and some time into it. and being able to say, yeah, we heard two different perspectives on whether there should be a new board or not. This is what we think is the way to go, the direction of way to go on that question. For example, and I don't know that we have a consensus on that question or anything. If we do, I think it would be helpful to get that, memorialized and
Are we in the number one or the first question in our mandate is the agricultural workers the right to organize? What I'm hearing,
let me say, it's not really. I think but that question was not really in the mandate. The mandate was to provide a structure. And we can say, yeah, here's the structure. We don't recommend it, but I think it's a little different from saying we don't recommend that workers be allowed the right to organize. We could say that, but I don't think it's in the charge explicitly.
I'm all in favor of saying of removing the exemption prohibiting agricultural laborers from organizing. It's saying rather than organizing, rather than setting up a framework for them to organize, we recommend this approach. So take off that, what I consider a mark of shame from 1935, which prohibits organizing, and say rather than create a structure to do that, we recommend this approach instead.
Well, in the event that the constitutional amendment passes, that wouldn't mean anything, would it? We're going to be voting on it and say biennium.
But there are still people who are groups of employees who are not allowed to organize, like the employees in the Attorney General's office. Right. And so there are exemptions still, and if we intend to make a statement that we support removing that exemption, and I think we should do that, deliver that.
Okay, I think that's different from what you talked about earlier. I was not willing to, I wanted the exemption put back in. But with the understanding that we would, in the interim, come up with ways that would make it, move, if you will.
Yeah. So we are saying different things.
I think we are.
I think you are different. I think you're on different sides maybe of.
Yeah, it may be semantical, but yeah.
But I also think, and I'm just going to repeat what I just said, and this is my interpretation of it, and maybe we can ask Sophie or Damien to doesn't need to be today. This is going to be, next week. But I don't think that we're really charged with even answering that question. I think the question is come up with a proposal for a framework. And you can recommend it or not, but it's still coming up with a proposal. So I think we can avoid even having to agree on this question because I don't think that's a question that we're required to answer.
Well, and I think that Brian and I do agree on the second part of the concept, which is.
We need to be
the first
fair to
part
our
irrelevant.
workers, yeah. There's no
Yeah,
way
so,
around
right,
it.
so we can focus
I get
on that and Okay, well, anybody else have anything to say about this?
Drive safely.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.